Today, our subject matter is we're talking about new technical aspects regarding the adjustment you're going to be doing on your patient's elbows. And what we're talking about today is a direct result of when I've had doctors setting up on my elbows, adjusting me in the past couple workshops. We did one in February here in Tulsa, and then the last one before that was in December. And I noticed some consistent errors in the setup process that would inhibit a good, effective elbow adjustment from taking place. So we're going to talk about those today and peel back the layers on both ulna and radius. And I'm going to be setting up on my skeleton model. This makes a real good model for setting up for elbow, because an actual holding a model that you hold is difficult because you have to actually hold the model up. So this is perfect. We have the humerus, we have a fully functioning glenohumeral joint, we got the radius and ulna, we have the wrist. So it works really good for demonstration purposes. So the first thing I want to get into are just kind of some general considerations for the elbow setup. And the main general consideration I'm going to talk about is the doctor's stance, the doctor positioning. Now, in chiropractic, I try to compare the extremity adjustment to the spine adjustment, and then from that we can kind of realize why do we have some errors that we experience in the setup process for different extremity adjustments. And many times it comes down to, with the extremities, your ability to maneuver the patient relative to your body, the doctor, is very variable. There's a lot of ability for you to move their extremity around in space relative to you and to the patient to get their body in place to provide a good, effective, solid adjustment. Well, that also breeds a lot of risk with it as well, too. See, with the spine, you have your patient lay face down on the table or on their back on the table. Maybe you're Gonstead and you use a cervical chair, or you put them on a knee chest. Whatever the case is, you're using some type of a fixed patient positioning model when you adjust the spine. And as a result, what you do is you basically say, okay, the patient's fixed in his position. I'm going to get my body in position relative to the patient. And you've already established this proprioceptive ability to know exactly where you need to stand to adjust their C-spine, where you need to stand to adjust their thoracics, where you need to stand to do a side posture, lower back adjustment if that's the technique, or a Thompson drop adjustment if that's the techniques you're using. So whatever the technique, spine technique, the patient's fixed on the adjusting table, making it more likely for you to establish good doctor position. With the elbow, with the wrist, with the elbow, but especially we're talking with the wrist today, with the elbow today, with the elbow, the patient's not fixed. They're very dynamic. You can maneuver the patient, and the patient can be moving while you're establishing your setup on them. So the patient can change their body position after you've established your doctor position. So one of the problems, or one of the areas for error or improper line of correction we have in this arena of elbow adjusting is, where do I stand? I'm the doctor. Where do I plant my feet relative to the patient? What's my doctor's stance? And that might seem like an elementary thing to you, but it's not. What happens is most doctors just stand wherever they're going to stand when it comes to the elbow, and that creates a lot of variability. And as a result, if you stand wherever you're going to stand, you just kind of move the patient's elbow to you. In other words, if I stand next to my model here and I just take a place and then adjust the elbow, I can move their arm relative to me and do the adjustment. Doesn't matter. Or I could stand over here and do the adjustment. Or I can come up front and I could do the adjustment. So see, I position myself relative to the patient's arm and elbow in three distinctly different, and you didn't see my feet, but I was moving my feet far distances on the ground, and all three of those, I can produce a thrust on their elbow. That breeds a lot of ground for error, because if you don't know precisely where you need to stand relative to the patient, it's like you're out in the sea, if you will. You're just kind of planting your shit wherever it sits type thing. You're going to go ahead and try to adjust the patient's elbow. So we have to look at the stance for both the ulna and the stance for the radius. Now, the good thing is, when you establish your stance, you're going to memorize that stance and use the same stance, the same positioning on every patient. They'd be very, very similar. But there's some different errors I've seen doctors establish with setting up on the various, elbow adjustments. First off, let's talk about the ulna. When we talk about adjusting the elbow, the ulna is going to be your primary adjustment after you adjust the scapula and humerus, of course. The elbow, what are we working on? We're working on the ulna, we're also working on the humerus, and we're also working on the radius, right? We have 3 bones that all articulate here at this joint we call the elbow, but we have to make sure that humerus has been appropriately positioned to allow us to adjust the elbow appropriately. So we're only adjusting the elbow after we cleared out the shoulder and the wrist. So that's one key point, and that wasn't even on my outline for today, but this is kind of going back to the basics, if you will. Anytime we teach the elbow adjustment, you always adjust the shoulder first, inclusive of the scapula and glenohumeral joint as a minimum. Then you adjust the wrist second. You clear out the wrist, do your carpal trio and whatever other adjustments you feel you need to do on your patient for their wrist. And then you finalize the upper extremity adjusting process with the ulna and the radius. So when we work on the elbow itself, adjust the ulna to the humerus and then the radius to the ulna. Okay, so we always adjust ulna first, radius second. That's the best way to manage this, because the radius is secondary. The ulna is ulna forms the hinge joint with the humerus. The radius, yes, there's a joint with the capitulum here, but the radius primarily we're adjusting it to the ulna. So if we look at flexion extension as the 2 motions we're looking at for elbow function, that's occurring between ulna and humerus primarily. Then the pronation supination, that's not actually an elbow function according to a lot of the different literature sources out there. The pronation supination, that's relative radius to ulna. And if you think about it, pronation supination isn't just occurring at the elbow, it's occurring at the distal part of the extremity between the radius and ulna at the distal radial ulnar joint. So there's different articulations involved here for adjusting the elbow, but realize we adjust through the shoulder first, wrist second, then first ulna, then second we're going to do the radius. So let's talk now about the stance. So we're going to talk about the stance for the ulna first, and then a couple key elements when it comes to the thrust, the contact, the thrust, the line of correction, and also the stabilization for the ulna. The stance, I want to first clear out a couple of the erroneous stances that doctors use, and I've had a doctor do this on me actually at one of the recent advanced training workshops. So it just goes down to, watch your videos, watch the videos on a regular basis and practice your body positioning and your stance and making sure you're doing things appropriately, because if you don't, you may be getting less than appropriate results. So let's look at an erroneous stance first of all. The first erroneous stance with the ulna, or the main one, is doctors will stand behind the patient and they'll set up on the ulna like this. And I realize I'm getting a little further from a microphone right now, so I'll try to talk a little louder and hopefully you don't have too much echo. But doctors will stand posterior to the patient, and this creates a couple situations. First of all, it's going to cause you to move the patient's arm into a range more of extension, or you might go more into abduction. But the thing is, you're positioning the patient into a less than adequate or less than comfortable position. But the primary reason we don't want to stand behind the patient is your contact and your line of direction is going to force you into a P to A type of a thrust, like I'm coming toward you on the video screen here. Okay, so we're going to go into extension. It's very hard to get a medial to lateral tracking. Our LOC is medial to lateral as a primary and P to A as a secondary. Well, if I'm behind the patient, it's very easy to go P to A as the primary motion, which can lead into hyperextension of the elbow. So the correct positioning for the doctor is to come around to the front of the patient over here, and I'm in front of the patient, and as opposed to extending the humerus, I'm actually flexing the humerus. See, the humerus doesn't stay right by the side. I flex it slightly, which is a more comfortable positioning for the patient, number one. When I take my contact, I'm not going to use my thenar pad here like this. I'm going to use the proximal phalanx, kind of like the knuckle here at the head of the first or second metacarpal in the proximal phalanx. So right here is my contact point, right on the medial aspect of the olecranon process of the ulna. So if you bend the elbow like this, you can see where that process is, where that contact point's going to be right there on the medial aspect. So that's my contact. Now, whenever you do the adjustment, a lot of times doctors, whenever they do the adjustment, they're going to do the thrust, and they know that the thrust is medial to lateral, but they incorporate an erroneous position or line of drive, which is going to cause more of a subluxation problem, worsening the subluxation. They're going to use extension of their forearm. So they'll set up on a patient and they use extension of the forearm just like this. You'll see them do this with the arm. So what that's doing, it's actually causing more of a supination of the patient's arm. So you'll see whenever they adjust the patient's arm or forearm, or elbow, I'm sorry, the ulna, they're going to do more of like a position like this, where they scoop upward like this, and they supinate the ulna. That's very painful. If you have a bad ulna or a bad elbow on you, the doctor, take your bad elbow and kind of go into extension and supinate the ulna as you do that, and you're going to feel the stress inside the deepest aspect of your joint there. You're going to feel extreme stress in your elbow. Now, if you do that, but you go the other way, like this, you'll notice there's no stress perceived in your elbow joint. It doesn't hurt. So a patient who's got an elbow pain or an elbow problem, if we adjust them and we do this type of thing and we supinate the ulna, we're creating extreme stress. What's our subluxation of the ulna? It's a medial ulna, posterior medial, with medial as the primary, but there's an element of supination as well. The ulna is supinated, and with that supination, we've got an increase in the carrying angle between the humerus and the ulna. So when we adjust, we're going to be very careful. And I say this, and I'm really beating this point in here because a lot of doctors do that when they provide the thrust, when they generate that thrust. But instead of the extension of your wrist, you want to use a subtle flexion of your wrist. See how my wrist does this now? It's more of a flexion. So when we do a flexion, we're actually pronating the ulna like that. So think about, a roundabout way to think about this is, it's like we are finding the medial aspect of the olecranon right here, and we're thrusting in a rotary type direction. Although we're not really being rotary, we are being rotary to an extent there. Our goal is to take the ulna from medial to lateral, subtle P to A, with a degree of pronation in our thrust, not supination. And I can't tell you the countless numbers of doctors who've adjusted my ulna who use that extension of their wrist and create that increased supination type positioning or malpositioning. It makes the subluxation worse, and it causes extreme stress inside my elbow. And I don't even have elbow problems or pain, but it's a very painful process to have done in your elbow. So you're probably adjusting your patient's elbows mostly when they have an elbow condition. They have tennis elbow or golfer's elbow or some type of elbow pain, and you're adjusting them. You want to make sure that you're stimulating the adjustment, stimulating the thrust in such a capacity that you're not causing more stress to their elbow. And I've seen this done so many times in a seminar situation, and doctors just kind of wince and they don't realize what just happened to them, and it just seems like the elbow is a painful experience, but it's not. It should be a very pleasant experience to have the elbow adjustment done. Now remember, we're only adjusting the elbow after we've cleared the scapula and humerus and the wrist. So shoulder first, wrist second, elbow third. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Any ideas?
Chain of command.
Chain of command. Yes, I like that.
Yep.
Somebody waved. Were you asking, wanting to answer, or Dr. Lurie? Dr. Miller. All right. So here's the reason why.
Because it's a stupid joint, and the shoulder and the wrist are far more complex.
Boom! $1,000,000 bonus points to you. That's exactly right. I wasn't even going to say that today, but that's exactly right. It's a stupid joint, and great memory. So what's Dr. Christian talking about? Well, the shoulder's smart. It has such a versatile range of motion. It's a ball and socket joint, and has so much ability and variety of motion. The wrist is very smart as well too. So there's a lot of dynamics there involved. With the elbow, it's just a stupid joint. It just kind of moves in just one plane of motion, back and forth, flexion, extension. Of course, you got pronation, extension, but it's really, it's very compensatory. And so a lot of movement can happen up here, and only a very little movements, very subtle movements happen here, but that can cause great pain. If you try to fix these very subtle movements, it's going to come back again and again and again, because why? The elbow's stupid. It's not very smart on its own. You have to correct the smart joints. You have to correct the shoulder and the wrist. When those are corrected, now you've created an environment for a properly functioning elbow. One of you on this webinar today was in Tulsa in February, and you made the comment, I forget who it was. It might be you, Dr. Arsenault. I'm not sure. Somebody made the comment, when I adjusted the glenohumeral joint, they said, wow, did you feel that release in my elbow? You're going to feel your patient's elbows release. You're going to feel that almost like a cavitational response here between the ulna and humerus. It's going to happen as a direct result of adjusting their shoulder. Typically on the glenohumeral joint, when they're supine on the table and you do the humeral head adjustment, you're going to feel the elbow release as the humeral head releases. They go hand in hand, they go together. So shoulder first, that creates a proper environment for a healthy functioning elbow. Then wrist second, which also produces that much more of a proper functioning environment for a healthy elbow. And then do your cleanup work. I call it cleanup work on the elbow joint itself. Okay. So, but Dr. Birdsall's right. It's the chain of command. It's the way it works, you know. Very similar with the knee, although the knee's a little different, you know. So the knee, you can do the ankle and foot, and then the knee and the hip. You don't necessarily have to do the foot, low back, and finish up with the knee. Okay, but the elbow, you definitely always want to do that chain of command. You want to do the shoulder first, wrist second, elbow third. You're going to find this too. If you adjust somebody with a painful elbow, like a tennis elbow or a golfer's elbow or just some general elbow pain condition, and you adjust them, you adjust the ulna, might go kapow, and make a real loud cavitational release. Then you adjust the radius, and bam, they say, wow, that really helped a lot. That feels better already. Well, then the same problem is going to present. It's going to come back, and there's really no long-term solution because the shoulder still subluxed, the wrist still subluxed, and the environment is there for a subluxed elbow. So if you adjust the shoulder first, wrist second, now those kapams and kabows and so forth, the loud audible releases you had in the elbow, they're very small. Incrementally, you get a lot less cavitational release at the elbow because you've already released that joint in a great capacity just by releasing and lining up the shoulder first and the wrist second. Okay, so it's very exciting to see the results of your elbow patients really soar because you've managed and done the elbow third in this chain of command here. Okay. Now, the next setup element I want to talk about with the ulna, this one here, the phrase I would say is, you may not be ready for this, because if you don't have your core setup in place, if you're not disciplined with your core setup, this could cause great stress to your patient, okay? I took my daughter out for the first time last weekend shooting with me at an indoor range I use in Tulsa here. I've got a couple handguns. I've got a 357 Magnum I shoot, and I've got a 9mm that I shoot. And, you know, I said, do you want to go shoot with me? Well, not really. And I kept saying that for a couple of weeks or months even. And finally she goes, sure, let's go. So I think she just wanted to spend time with me. So we went to the shooting range, and I knew the 357 would be kind of rough on her wrist with the recoil, and the 9mm probably too, never shooting. So I thought, I don't want to scare her. So I rented a 22 pistol. So here's the bullet, or the shell, for a 22 pistol. It's not big, you know, I don't know, you can see how, there's my finger, okay, how big it is, but the 9mm is right here. So this is the bullet that belongs to the gun that I wasn't sure it would have more recoil. So she might have not been ready for this. It could scare her. So she was very hesitant to shoot the pistol with this 22 pistol first. She took one shot. First she goes, "Do you do it? I want to watch you." She took one shot. She goes, and I only put one bullet in the gun. They had a clip. You could put like 15 or 20 in there. So she goes, "Oh, I want to put some more. Can you put 5 of them in?" I was like, "Okay, this is one shot." So it wasn't too long. She goes, "Can we come back here a lot of times?" So I let her shoot she shot the 22 really good. She hit the bullseye a couple times and she was on the target for the most part. Then I let her shoot the 9mm. So she went from this to this, okay? She shot the bigger gun. And I thought, you might not be ready for this, but do you want to give it a shot? She goes, "Sure." So she shot it. She goes, "Wow, can I do some more again?" I had one bullet in the gun. So I put around a 5 in there. She shot 5 times in a row and I was videotaping it. But we pulled the target back. She missed the target on every shot on the 9mm completely. It was a big target, big sheet with like 6 targets. She missed the whole page of all the targets, and she was shooting on the center target. With the 22, she was putting the rounds into a nice little targeted area consistently with accuracy and precision. She lost that with the 9mm. Why? She wasn't quite ready for it. She had fun, but I could see her flinching. She pre-flinched prior to. She was anticipating the recoil of the gun, and then but she wants to shoot it again. Now the other gun I have is a 357. You can see the size of the bullet, over here on the 357, how much more gunpowder there is. That has a lot bigger recoil, so I shot that one. And interestingly, I'm a lot more accurate with the 9mm than I am with the 357. There's a bigger recoil. So when it comes to the elbow adjustment, this next stabilization tip, in order to help you to achieve maximum leverage when you adjust the ONA, you may not be ready for this. So go cautiously with this, because done incorrectly or done correctly with other elements of the setup being done incorrectly, it could cause greater stress to your patient's elbow. But this technique for maximizing the leverage on the ulna adjustment, might be the point that you need, or the element that you need to really get a good solid release and corrective force on your patient's elbow adjustment. So use this cautiously. Make sure you test your technique. Watch the videos, come back and watch this webinar, and make sure you're doing all the other elements correctly before you implement this next leverage tip that's going to help you maximize and get the best leverage for the best cavitation release and the best biomechanically correct adjustment for the ulna. So let me just teach a couple basic points that are very review. You'll see them on the webinar or on the video if you watch the videos on the ulna. Let me teach you a couple basic points first. Then I'm going to teach you this leverage tip, okay? So the first point is, when you set up on and adjust the ulna, you're going to have the patient, you're going to be perpendicular to the patient, okay? So here's the front of the patient here. I'm perpendicular to him. So we took a line on the floor, heel to toe for the patient. I'm directly perpendicular in front of the patient. Your stance should be such that when you just put your hand behind the patient's elbow like this, everything's real neutral. You're not contorting your body at all. I know you can't see my whole body here, but I'm just neutrally positioned in front of the patient, perpendicular to them. Your stabilization hand is right here at the distal radius ulnar joint. You're not on the wrist. You have to be on the distal radius and ulna. There's very little grip. You're not gripping at all here, okay? But one of the most important points is my elbow here. See my flappy elbow? The kids have a game they play called Flappy Bird, I think it's called. So this is flappy elbow. We don't want a flappy elbow. We want that locked in tight to our side. So my elbow needs to be solid to my side, and there's no motion here. When I palpate the elbow, notice I'm flexing and extending the elbow on the skeleton model. All that movement is happening right here with my proximal hand. The contact hand is what palpates the elbow into extension for extension maximum, and back out, and also medial to lateral. This hand is completely stationary and solid. Now, when I say solid, it's not gripping down tightly. It's very loosely, casually positioned like a glove, like a gentle glove, if you will, around the distal aspect of the forearm. When I say glove, it's just like if you put a a really nice fitting leather glove on your hand. It covers the entirety of the skin of your hand, and there's no tight spots. It's just very comfortable. So you want this to be very comfortable for the patient down here at their distal forearm. If they have a watch on their forearm, you want to make sure you remove that watch. You don't want to be over top their bracelets and the jewelry here, okay? So this hand is solid. These are all the preliminary things that I know is review for you. You've seen this time and time again, but you want to make sure that you've mastered that before you do this next element of this adjustment, okay? Let me back my skeleton up just a little bit here. So to gain the maximum leverage on the corrective thrust for the ulna, what we're going to do as we apply the corrective thrust, which is right here, medial to lateral, and remember, we're not doing this. We're not going into extension. We're going into subtle flexion of my wrist, okay? So as I thrust on the ulna, again, I'm doing this. I'm not doing this, okay? This leads to more supination, which is very stressful in the elbow of the patient. This leads to more pronation, which is more of a corrected type range of motion. So when we do the adjustment just like this with my contact hand, what I'm going to do, this hand is going to apply a counter thrust. See, from here to here, that's a counter thrust. Now let me show you what that is not. It is not a extension. I'm not going back like that or that way. I'm coming in toward me. So take your hand out from your side like this into external rotation and then internally rotate. So go from here to here. Now that's a broad range of motion. Now come out just a little bit from your abdomen and go in. Just maybe a couple inches is all we're doing, okay? That's the motion. So when we're set up appropriately here, and we're doing this counter thrust, when we thrust with this hand up here on the thrust, that's our counter rotation right there, okay? Now, you're not going the whole way into your abdomen. This is a very subtle little shift of motion. It's internal rotation at your glenohumeral joint. That's the motion right there. So there's never any hyperextension of the distal forearm. So this is very important because what happens is when you adjust here, you may not get enough movement for the release, but this helps to generate that as a counter thrust, which helps you open up the joint here and get the release the patient needs for a corrected elbow aligning process. This reminds me real similar to whenever I was learning cervical chair, learning the Gonstead technique, and I was at Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, getting trained. I've been up there many, many times over the years. And so I was unsuccessful at adjusting the cervical spine on the patient or student at that time in the cervical chair. I could do the modified rotary brake with them supine, but I couldn't do it in a chair until finally somebody showed me, one of the instructors showed me I had to use some counter thrust. So when I was set up with the patient in the chair, I had to counter thrust with my stabilization hand, not whipping their neck, not bending their head. It's just this hand had to have a subtle counter thrust because what was happening is the patient kept going forward, their torso went forward, my stabilization wasn't helping, it wasn't working. So now with the ulna adjustment, typically it's not that your stabilization isn't helping, it's not that the whole arm is going out away from you and you're not getting the energy you need. That's typically not the challenge here, but sometimes that can be a challenging joint to release, so that counter thrust will help to open up the joint and get the release that you want to achieve in your patient. Be very, very careful. If you're not establishing proper line of correction, if you're doing the extension of your thrust like we talked about earlier in this webinar today, and then you do the counter thrust, you're just adding insult to injury there. So do not do that counter thrust. You may not be ready for it yet. Okay, you may not be ready for it yet until you hone in your technique and do it appropriately with all capacities, all elements of the elbow adjustment. So watch the elbow videos that you have, watch this webinar a few times, practicing your patients, and before you implement this counter thrust for maximum leverage on ulna, make sure you have those down, okay? Any questions on ulna so far, or the leverage technique or anything like that?
One thing I want to add that helped me out a lot was to watch kind of what your patient's elbows are doing. If, you know, I know we've all had it because elbows are very, I mean, even for myself, when I get my elbow adjusted, I still kind of a little bit weary, just because it's a little awkward, right? But if you see your patient kind of lifting their shoulder up like that, you're putting way too much pressure and extension into that. So you got to be very careful. If you find them kind of, you know, raising up with you, that's another thing. And then when you're thrusting and you do the thrust and the elbow bends, that means you've put too much P to A pressure on that, and it's creating that bend. So you got to make sure you get that lockout real nice, and make sure you bring that arm really close into your body so you can have real good control of that. And then when you go ahead and deliver that thrust, it really doesn't take much. This is my favorite adjustment to do. I don't know why, but elbows are really fun for me. And it's just really important to keep everything in control, because if you lock your arm in, okay, you can't really see it, but if you get their arm really close into your body here, right, and then when you go to deliver that thrust, so I got the arm here, and I wish I had a little skeleton, but I've got the hand here and the wrist here, and I'm rolling in. I've got it close to my body, right, because that allows me to have control here with what I'm doing. If you have it out far, you're going to do that counter thrust, and that's going to create a leverage that you don't want to have. So keep it nice and tight inside your body and deliver that thrust real quick. It doesn't have to be super, super deep. It really doesn't take much once you get the lockout going. So pay attention to what your patients are doing and how kind of they're reacting. And then as you see them do different things, try to change it up a little bit until you get comfortable.
That's a couple points Dr. Bergstall talked about. Since I have a skeleton here, I'll just kind of show, because those are real good points. The thing that you talked about going into flexion, many times, and this is actually a good thing, believe it or not. If you have this happen, this should be a sign to you that you're not going the wrong direction that would be injurious to the patient, okay? This here would not be injurious to the patient. It just wouldn't produce an effective correction of the elbow. And you probably realize what happens is whenever you thrust on the patient's elbow, sometimes it goes more into flexion. Like there, we thrusted, but the patient's elbow is flexing. Well, when we adjust the patient's elbow, we're near maximal extension. We're about 3 to 5 degrees from full extension of the patient's elbow prior to the thrust. Well, when we do thrust, it goes to near complete extension maximum during the thrust. We're just not hyperextending. But because maybe you're fearful of hyperextending, you might cause flexion to occur. It's almost like you don't have enough P to A, and that's typically due to your body position. Is turn your feet just a little bit, so that way it changes your line of drive. So straight across, which is settled elements of P to A, is what you need. The other thing is, Dr. Bergstall talked about if your arm's out here. This is so common too. I'm glad he brought this point up. This arm's out here. It's so easy to kind of get that flappy bird going on and hyperextending the elbow. So you might be thinking that you're doing the leverage technique we talked about, but you're actually hyperextending. So be very careful with the elbow right in close to your body, like Dr. Bergstall had mentioned there. So those are two very good elements. Now, one of the things that on the Ona that is a tip that I've used, I taught myself years ago, I didn't talk about today, but it kind of helps you stay within the confines of where you're supposed to with your line of drive for delivering the thrust on the Ona. It's almost like when you drive a car and there's lines on the road. Those lines are the confines. If you stay within the lines, the solid line on your right and the dotted line on your left, it's going to keep you from going off on the shoulder of the road and rolling your car over or something like this. You have to be within the confines. So you kind of like, if you're driving on the road, you just look far off in the distance. If you look far off in the distance, it's easier to keep your car going real smooth in the confines of the road. If you look right down at the tip of your hood of your car at the closest part of the pavement, it's like you're going to get off course because your vision isn't far enough out. So try that. Drive on a road on a highway, and just don't do it too long, and look real close down at the pavement, and you'll veer off the side of the road or over the line type thing because you're not looking up in the distance. So with that, picking a point off in the distance and thrusting toward that point is a great way to make sure you stay within the confines of the line of thrust or the line of drive you need for a correct Ona adjustment. So I don't think I do this on any other adjustment except for the Ona. And the way I do that is I'll find, like, if this is my model here, or my skeleton, if I position kind of like this, okay, and if I was standing such that I'd be thrusting in that direction right there, I would look at the corner of my framed, diploma on the wall. So if you probably didn't hear me there because my microphone, I would look at the corner of the diploma on the wall, and I would fire my thrust. I would thrust to the diploma, the corner of that diploma on the wall, and that causes me to shoot perfectly through the joint plane like I'm supposed to. So I developed that technique for myself because I used to hyperextend. I wasn't thinking. I'd go too much into extent, or I'd go too much into flexion sometimes. But when I found that point that was right through that line of correction, I just thrust it right to the light switch or to the corner of the monitor or whatever it is in your room. Find a fixed point and thrust toward it. Okay, that helps keep you within the confines of your line of correction. So a lot of good little details I wasn't thinking about talking about today that we're pulling out. And that's a review point that we talked about that in the past. So now with the radius, I want to talk about the line of a correction and establishing an appropriate line of correction on radius. This becomes a palpation type thing. You want to get really good with the understanding where the radial head is and just the anatomy and the structures you're dealing with there. So if you have an elbow model, it makes it really nice to kind of see. If you have a full skeleton model, which you probably don't, it's also, although believe it or not, an elbow model that you buy from like shopanatomical.com probably would be a little bit nicer from looking at the elbow joint complex itself than what I have on the full skeleton here, just because they probably put more detail into the elbow model as far as the elbow is concerned. But if we look at the anatomy of the radius and ulna, there's a plane line, and I know it's kind of hard to see here. There's a plane line that this radial head sits in here in its groove in the ulna here. So if I take and hold the ulna, I can maneuver this radial head, I can palpate it here, and it helps me establish where that plane line exists. It's a great way to just kind of feel where the plane line is. So if you go to your spouse or a staff member, to your next patient who comes in, you can just kind of like grab a hold of their ulna, just let's just say the bulk of their elbow on the medial aspect, and then come around laterally and take your index finger and thumb and just kind of manipulate that head of the radius through that groove and figure out where that plane line is. That's going to help you establish your stance. Remember we talked about earlier in this webinar today that the patient with a spine patient, they're fixed on the table, and with the elbow patient, you just kind of stand haphazardly or stand wherever you're going to stand, and then you kind of move the patient's body to fit your stance. You want to get out of that model, and you want to find the model of adjusting where you're going to actually plan your stance, like stand appropriately to the patient's anatomy. And part of it is understanding where the joint plane line is and how these bones move relative to each other. So just start palpating that radial head just to get a good feel for the plane line. Now, once you establish that, it's going to be real similar on every patient. So once you establish your stance is real similar on every patient, but you have to learn that stance, okay? So for radius, once we establish that plane line, our stance is essentially posterolateral to the patient. Now, our feet aren't perpendicular to the patient's feet, like with the ulna, but they're obliquely. They're angled, from P to A, and lateral to medial relative to the patient. So there's a precise location at the posterolateral aspect of the patient's body where you want to be. Now, that's assuming that the patient's arm is relaxed in a consistent position. In other words, there's some patients, if you have their arm way out here and other patients way back here, well, your stance would be all over the place. So you want to make sure that your stance is such that, and the patient's anatomy is such that you're doing it consistently across the board on all of your patients, okay? So it's just like putting your patients face down on the table consistently across all your patients, or maybe on their back supine consistently with all your patients. So your patients have a certain stance, their arm has a certain position relative to their trunk of their body, and then your stance is positioned relative where the patient is positioned. Now, at that point, you should be right in line with that joint plane line. So you got used to that joint plane line just by holding the elbow here and figuring out where that is, like that, okay? Once you establish that, you just do the same thing on every patient, okay? Now, when you're palpating for the precise line of drive for the particular patient, what you're going to do is you're going to, in that stance you established, you're going to keep your thumb right here, kind of between the radius and the ulna, if you will, on the radial head, right there on the annular ligament, and you're going to pronate and supinate, okay? You're going to feel that radial head maneuver or glide inside of its groove there with the ulna. Typically, the ulna is, or the radius will typically have a point of crepitus, or where the radial head will kind of pop out of the annular ligament almost under your thumb. You're going to feel there's an inconsistency in that quality of motion. Right where you sense that inconsistency or of the quality of motion, that's where you're going to stop with this hand here. See, this hand's doing the pronation, supination. This hand up here, it can also test extremes of extension. So it can go in and out like this with flexion extension. This hand here is locked into your side though. So this hand here is only stimulating the pronation, supination. This hand here is doing the flexion extension. So they work kind of in tandem. And as you pronate, supinate, you can flex and extend to test the end feel of that radial head. So normally when you find the subluxation in your patient, their radius will be near its pronation maximum. You're not going to feel, when they're supinated, you're not going to feel restrictions normally with a supinated forearm. Normally it's going to be when the patient's forearm is pronated, okay? So you're going to stand posterolateral to the patient with a pronated forearm, and you're going to palpate throughout a range of pronation or pronation supination as you oscillate back and forth and you test that extension maximum. So there's two elements of fixation that you're feeling for. First, you're just feeling for the inconsistencies in the pronation capacity of the patient as you feel that rotation of the radial head. You might feel kind of a crepitus or a kind of a grinding sensation, or like the radial head kind of pops out of the groove a little bit. And then you're also testing the extremes of extension with your contact hand thumb while you pronate and supinate in various degrees. And there you're actually testing the translation of the head of the radius from a P to A and lateral to medial line of correction. When you feel where there's a restriction and it doesn't glide so well, doesn't test so well, there's a fixation, that's the place where you stop. You'll find those two, if you can feel both of those restrictions, they're right at the same location. In other words, if you just palpate pronation, supination, and you feel the radial head, this inconsistency, that's typically the same place where you're going to feel there's a restriction going into that extension maximum, okay? But keep in mind, it's your proximal hand that establishes and palpates the extension capacity of the elbow of the radius. It's your distal hand that palpates and maneuvers the pronation and supination. So many doctors forget to lock their elbow in to their side. You want to make sure you lock your elbow in to your side here and keep that solid as you're palpating. And then as you adjust, this elbow needs to be tightly locked in. So I'm actually adducting my forearm, or adducting my arm to the side of my rib cage here, and I'm keeping, there's pressure. So I'm actually, if you sit or stand there watching this webinar, just kind of take your arm like this and bring it down to your side and then compress it into your side, like you're squeezing your arm to your body. You should feel that. When you set up on a patient's elbow, you should be compressing your arm down into, let's call it forced adduction, into the side of the trunk of your body. That makes sure that you're keeping your forearm positioned and solid, okay? So that's a very critical thing to get used to doing that habitually. If you don't do that, 100% of the time, you're going to be hyperextending the patient's elbow 100% of the time. And you can watch yourself in the mirror. If you palpate a patient's elbow, and you see this happening, notice this hand here, okay? It's going back and forth. You're probably noticing, if you look yourself in the mirror, you'll see this happening. You want to see this. You want to see this totally stationary as you do the motion palpation, okay? Now, one last thing as we take our stabilization on the distal radius. With the ulna, we stabilized the distal forearm generally. We just kind of wrapped our hand around the distal elements of the forearm and just held that real gently but securely, no gripping. With the radius, we have to have a little bit more intent on our stabilization. We want to reach around and we want to be on the dorsum of the radius and the palmar aspect of the radius with our stabilization. So we're not stabilizing generally, we're stabilizing specifically on the radius. Now, this skeleton here makes it very difficult to show this point, okay? A live human would be quite different because here there's not the same range of motion capacity. So, but I'm going to kind of teach the erroneous stabilization. Doctors will grab a hold of the radius here, just like this, and that's how they stabilize. You want to have the patient's forearm pronated and reach around the ulna and stabilize the radius. See how the ulna is going kind of between my hand here? I'm reaching over the ulna, where before I was reaching right onto the radius. That's erroneous. That's correct. You want to, like a C, reach over the ulna and then get your thumbs on the dorsum of the radius and your thumb or fingers on the dorsum and your thumb on the volar aspect of the radius. Why is that? It's because on a live patient, what you'll find as you pronate their forearm, if you're just holding the radius, you're not reaching around, your wrist will be really flexed and you have to kind of cock your body down to get in a position, which is really odd and awkward, and it's going to cause problems. When you reach over the ulna, it's going to allow you to stand up nice and tall and be very relaxed as you pronate the forearm into position. So practice both of those so you can actually show yourself kind of the good and bad of both of them, and you'll experience why not reaching over the ulna is a problem. So in other words, when we stabilize for radius, we want to reach over the patient's forearm like this and take our stabilization on the radius. We don't want to reach like this, okay? Again, that one is much easier to show on a live human being versus a skeleton model because the ranges of motion are more true on a human, okay? So, okay, so that pretty much wraps up some of the line of drive, line of correction, setup, characteristics, and technical aspects I wanted to cover today with the elbow. Again, these are elements that, you know, doctors adjusting my elbow at the last workshops, I've noticed were consistent things amongst doctors that we wanted to kind of discuss this and talk about it. There were some good questions some of you had today. Is there any other questions before we go back to our daily routine today? Okay. All right. That's good then. So we're almost at the top of the hour. So I want to thank you, docs, all for being on here today. I want to have you guys have a great week. We've been praying for everybody, for your practices, for your health. You know, you're in contact with a lot of patients, and we want you to maintain your health so you can be strong and the health of your family. So Kyle and I are always praying for every one of you guys. We love you all. Thanks for being present here today, and we'll see you on our next live advanced training. Thanks, docs.